Good evening. We're so glad to have you here on this kind of dreary day. But welcome everyone to the Pratt Library. My name is Vivian Fisher, and I am Deputy Chief of the Pratt Library State Library Resource Center here at the Central Library. And we are joined this evening with our guest author, Kidada Williams, writer, associate professor, and historian, who teaches courses on African Americans, American history, and historical research methods at Wayne State University. She is the author of They Left Great Marks and host and producer of the podcast Seizing Freedom. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times, Dame, Slade, and Bridge Magazine. This evening, she will discuss her latest work, I Saw Death Coming, which examines the Reconstruction era through the lens of African Americans in the South. Please join me in welcoming Kidada Williams to Baltimore and the Pratt Library.
Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it, especially in the rain. I'm here to tell the story of my new book, I Saw Death Coming. The story takes place mostly in the post-emancipation South. It follows African American families on their journeys out of slavery, through their experiences of the war white Southerners waged on their freedom, to their testimonies before Congress and beyond. It concludes with how families tried to keep the story of what happened to them alive. Tonight, I'm going to center two families to illuminate the war Confederates waged on African Americans' freedom. On a November night in 1871, just outside of Aberdeen, Mississippi, Edward Crosby stepped outside to get some water for his thirsty child. Suddenly, he heard and felt the thunder of a team of horses. He gazed out, and he saw about 30 disguised men descending on his home. Their mounts were draped in full bodycloth coverings. Mrs. Crosby, who must have heard or seen the men approaching too, asked Edward who and what they were. Edward had heard stories about armed white men on horseback galloping through the countryside, torturing and murdering Black families in the middle of the night during recent elections. Extremists and their apologists often referred to these raids euphemistically as visits, masking their brutality behind the veneer of a friendly social call. Edward told his wife he reckoned the gang heading towards them was what people in their community called Ku Klux, shorthand for the Ku Klux Klan. In the spring of 1866, white men in Pulaski, Tennessee, formed social clubs in which they sometimes donned masks and elaborate costumes, and they performed musical entertainment. The men called themselves Ku Klux after the Greek word circle. Klansmen's activities quickly spread across the South, evolved over time to roaming armed through communities in the middle of the night, conducting paramilitary attacks on Black and white Southerners. In time, Klansmen's work gave rise to an extremist movement that became so widespread that any man or group of men who wanted to kill or intimidate their targets might be affiliated with the Klan, whether they were actually members or not. And as more white Southern men mustered into the Klan's ranks and experimented with their acts of terror, they grew more deadly. Edward Crosby and his family had joined more than 4 million other Black people who snatched freedom from Confederates and tried to live upright and build a morally just world for their families after the Civil War. By 1870, Black Southerners had picked themselves up from slavery. They had reassembled their families to the best of their ability. They worked, I should say, harder for themselves than they did for the people who held them in bondage. They established communities with churches, orphanages, and schools. Some acquired land and opened their own businesses. Others, like Edward, were working, being industrious, saving money with their eyes on the prize of their own homesteads. And to protect all these rights and to secure their families' futures, men like Edward wanted to vote and serve in office. Edward's former enslaver was now his landlord and employer. He saw these strides African Americans had made as a threat to his ongoing mastery. He told Edward he would kill him if he tried to vote. But Edward knew the only way he could break the grip that enslavers still had on his life and on his children's futures was to help elect candidates who would advance his right to freedom. So he showed up to vote, but he was denied the ballot he requested. Defeated, Edward went home and waited for the potential fallout. That's why when Edward saw the white men bearing down on his home, he knew they were Ku Klux. Worried that the death he had heard about being visited upon other Black people in his community was coming for him, but hoping that it might spare his wife and children, Edward slipped into his family's smokehouse. He thought the men might not think to look there in case they decided to search the property for him. When the posse arrived into Crosby's yard, several men got down from their horses and called out for Edward. Although he was terrified, Edward retained his composure and stayed in his hiding place. Mrs. Crosby calmly told the men she didn't know where her husband was. She thought maybe he's visiting his sister. The white men hung around for a bit, dithering, trying to figure out what to do, before accepting that they wouldn't get their target and leaving. The Crosby's protection scheme worked. No one was physically hurt in the raid, but that didn't mean they emerged unscathed. Secession and the founding of the Confederacy were less than a decade in the past. Barely 5 years separated them from the end of the bloody Civil War and their sprint into freedom. Extremist arrival revealed to the Crosbys that white Mississippians had marked them as enemies, and this terrified the family and left them afraid their lives would never be the same. Like I imagine many of you, when I was in school, I was either not taught anything about Reconstruction or I was taught that it failed. What no one said outright was that Black people were freed from slavery, given every chance to succeed, rights in the vote, and that they failed to make the most of it. That's not what people say, but that's what the failure narrative means. That never made sense to me, but this is what I learned in school. So, like many, I moved on to research other, more worthy topics because who spends time studying a failure? But the more I trained as a professional historian, and the more I researched the records of the era, the more I recognized what a transformative moment this was. The records show Black people made the absolute most with freedom, putting their families' need to be free and secure at the forefront of their fight. There were so many truly revolutionary developments: abolition, the opening of schools, the opening of hundreds of churches, a boom in Black land ownership and entrepreneurship, national citizenship rights and protections, voting rights for Black men, and Black office holding, that the historian Eric Foner has called it the second founding after the American Revolution. Now, enslavers fought hard to sustain their privileges in the American system. They launched a torrent of attacks on Black people who were reaping the rewards of Reconstruction's expansion of freedom and democracy. And after Confederates overthrew Reconstruction, these whites crafted the big lie that the experiment in American democracy had failed. They falsely claimed that white Northerners had unfairly punished white Southerners for secession by enacting, quote, Black rule. Black men voted and were elected into office, but they never enacted any policies that hurt white people or took away any of their rights. But none of that mattered to the racists who were determined to deprive Black people of any opportunity to transcend slavery. So they falsely claimed that emancipation, equal rights, and the franchise were wasted on Black people. And these claims were part of a larger white supremacist political project to deny Black people dignity and equality. With Black people not knowing their place, white Southerners claimed they simply had no choice. They had to restore their honor, and the only way for them to do that was by forming white terror gangs, overthrowing their oppressors, and installing the racist apartheid system of Jim Crow. Black people, driven by a sense of self-regard that I think could only come from a people who had seized their freedom and picked themselves up from slavery, reported extremist violence, and in so doing created the register of the war white Southerners waged on them after the Civil War. The scholarship and the historical records of the period reveals this. Reconstruction didn't fail, white Southerners overthrew it, and white Westerners and Northerners essentially let them. I Saw Death Coming tells that story, but shows how Black people understood and articulated the human costs of Reconstruction's overthrow and abandonment. What happened to the Crosby family was part of what I call the war after the Civil War. Now, it might seem odd to liken what we've been taught was the peace to war, but I think it's important to acknowledge that wars never end as neatly as we often think they do. They're often followed by new conflicts. After the Civil War, the new conflict was white Southerners' fight to undercut Reconstruction's expansion of freedom and democracy. And so there was no peace, especially not for Black people in many areas of the South. And families like the Crosbys knew it. White extremists targeted Black people with regularity and with shocking impunity. They shot down Black male voters at the polls. They stalked Black office holders and offered them bribes to leave office. And if they refused, they killed them. They kidnapped Black men and women at gunpoint and disappeared them, disposing of their bodies in waterways and woods or just along roads. They ambushed families with nighttime raids that are very much like today's home invasions. And during these visits, white men who held Black families hostage subjected them to humiliation, torture, and murder. And thousands of men, women, and children were injured and killed. Now, Black people resisted this violence, to be sure. Some hid or fled like Edward, and we don't like to admit it today, but hiding and running from 30 men who are coming to probably kill you makes total sense. But others bore arms, defending their homes, injuring or killing their attackers. But one of the other ways that African Americans resisted this violence was by reporting it to authorities. Facing the prospect that the world wouldn't know what white Southerners did to them, that there might not be some form of redress, that free Black futures might be forestalled, survivors like Edward stepped forward at great risk to themselves and their families and reported violence to local authorities. And if that didn't pan out, they reported it to the Freedmen's Bureau and the US Army. They went to governors, other office holders, the press, even members of Congress and the President of the United States. And as they told their stories, they revealed how much they had gained with freedom and what they were losing to white violence. The visit to the home of Abe and Eliza Lyon had significantly different results from the one on the Crosbys. Abe and Eliza Lyon were lined up on the starting blocks of freedom when slavery was abolished. Having dreamed of this moment for most of their remembered lives, they sprinted to fulfill their dreams of self-determination and prosperity. By 1870, the Alabama couple had accomplished a great deal. Abe was 30 years old, Eliza was 35. They got legally married. They set up their home in a little village in Choctaw County. Abe was working as a blacksmith from his own shop. Eliza left her job on the plantation in domestic service and was keeping her own house. They had amassed a hoard of hogs, a significant investment that indicates they were producing cured meats and breeding specifically for the market. Their 3 children, William, Ella, and Annie, were all enrolled in school. Through their combined industry, Abe and Eliza had saved $600, the relative worth of which is more than $200,000 today. That's how much they saved in 5 years. And they planned to move to Demopolis, buy property, and build a home of their own. They were living their best post-emancipation life. And I think that's important to acknowledge, in part because of the failure narrative, but because these testimonies and other records made clear that they made the most of freedom. And those achievements provide context for why Confederates targeted them. On June 6, 1871, Abe had spent the day in his blacksmithing shop, and Eliza finished her homemaking tasks. The children had completed their chores and lessons, with time for play afterwards. They were all in bed at their home at 11 p.m. when someone knocked on their door and asked if Abe was home. The family had never heard any threats, and were not thinking of such a thing, Eliza later said. What had happened is that white men in the neighborhood were commenting to Abe on how well his shop was doing. But Abe didn't think that much of it at the time. He was working hard, he was doing what he was supposed to do, and he was making money. So Abe answered that he was home, and he got up from bed to answer the door. But something, perhaps the sight or sound of the visitors, and his awareness of the threats they pose, or just a feeling, his skin tightening and puckering with goosebumps, something so terrified Abe that he didn't move. Human bodies and minds are wired to sustain themselves, and when under attack, focus solely on survival and avoiding injury. When the mind detects threats to life, like Abe experienced, it triggers pre-programmed escape plans by secreting stress hormones to propel the body into action, specifically to survive by running, hiding, or fighting. But for some people, the unthinkable happens. Their brain's defense circuitry shuts down, and they freeze. Abe might have felt heavy, as though he were in a dream or in a nightmare from which he hoped that he would awaken. But this wasn't a dream, and that horrified him. Eliza, who was able to remain calm, said Abe, quote, looked like he was in a perfect scare, suggesting that he was paralyzed by fear. Abe remained in that trance-like state, prompting Eliza to act in hopes of guiding her husband to safety and protecting herself and their children. Eliza grabbed Abe, trying to steer him out the back door. He was so scared, she recalled. He wheeled around the room, not knowing what to do. Eliza's hope that her husband would regain control of his senses was soon dashed. The invaders burst through the door, threw a rope over his head, and dragged him outside and away from their home. Eliza yelled to her neighbors and any passersby for help, but no one came. To silence Eliza's screams, the attackers drew their guns on her. They told me if I didn't hush hollering, they would blow a hole right through me, she said. Eliza knocked away one gun with her hand. The men, while angry at her resistance, held fire. But Eliza said they told her they would finish with me directly. The night riders carried Abe away from his home and up a hill nearby. Eliza couldn't follow. Soon she saw the flash and heard the blast of a double-barrel shotgun. And then one of the men shouted an order for the rest of the gang to fire, and they did. After the terrorists killed Abe, Eliza spotted about 75 men returning to her house. I knew they were going to kill me, she said. Eliza ran inside to gather the children to flee, but her son William had disappeared, probably to go and get help. Moving with her daughters by her side, Eliza snuck out back to a field neighboring her home. They stopped at a thicket of woods to monitor the men's activities and take stock. But Eliza could go no farther without knowing Williams' whereabouts. But staying put rendered her girls and her vulnerable to discovery. Eliza and the girls watched from the woods as the white men made up a light and began searching and ransacking their home. They tore up everything, she said. Wearing only their night clothes, Eliza and the girls moved farther into the woods as the night riders shot up her home. It sounded like there was over 100 shots at once, she said. She and the girls remained hidden until sunrise, when she could see the men had left. That's when she went to confirm Abe's killing, and then to find William. Eliza and the children lost Abe, their cash, and all their belongings, that year's crop, their hogs, and most of Abe's tools. Their home had been destroyed, and the men's knowledge that they had left an adult witness meant that it probably wasn't safe for the family to remain living on the homestead. Eliza reported what happened to authorities. A grand jury was convened to investigate the spate of attacks and spree killings. Abe wasn't the only one targeted, but many of the witnesses were too afraid to talk. But Eliza was ready. But it's not clear who or what spooked Eliza. But she and the children suddenly shot out of Choctaw County. En route in their escape, she learned that Abe's killers were pursuing them, but she and the children managed to pick up their pace and safely make it to Demopolis, where she thought they might be safe. Receiving a flood of reports like this attack on Eliza and the attack on Edward Crosby, Congress convened an investigation into what they call the execution of laws and the safety of the lives and citizens of the people of the United States. The committee's work became known as the Klan hearings because of how prominently violence, like the visits these families received, featured in the investigation. Lawmakers traveled to hotspots of Southern disorder. They go to places like Jacksonville, they go to Atlanta, they go to Macon, and all of these other places to listen to testimony from office holders, voters, accused perpetrators, and victims. Families like the Crosbys and the Lyons had greeted emancipation with great expectations. Many of them achieved their dreams of freedom or were on their way to doing so when the white men came for them. When Congress issued the call for witnesses, they stepped forward, hoping to convince federal officials to take action to end the violence so their families and all other Black families would be safe. Edward wanted to live in his home community in peace, pursue his dream of land, and secure his children's futures. Eliza, now a widow, lost everything. Displaced from her home community and support network, she was struggling to care for herself and her children, which was exactly what their attackers intended, to destroy everything Black people built and leave them with nothing. The gears of their lives might never start to turn again if the violence continued. So they risked their lives and their families' futures by testifying. Brave survivors make their way to the hearing sites by foot, train, boat, wagon, carrying the stories of violent attacks. As extremists made clear, their determination to sustain slavery as much as possible. They had and they would release Black people from bondage, but we see from who they attacked, when they attacked, and why they attacked them, that they didn't believe that Black people had the right to be free or the right to have any rights that are in the Constitution. Edward, Eliza, and other survivors' decision to testify was informed by their individual and collective sense of self-love, self-respect, and what Toni Morrison called self-regard. Targeted people's testimonies provide a counter-narrative to the stories we've been told about Reconstruction's failure. In naming their attackers, detailing their injuries, saying the names of their slain kin, and keeping the record alive, survivors said Black people's lives, freedoms, and futures mattered. But what survivors really wanted was for federal officials to end the violence and for their families to be made whole and secure. Reporting and testifying about the violence was one of their best ways to try to defend against the erasure of what happened to them. The testimonies did help drive a federal investigation into Klan violence. And that investigation helped drive the Klan, the first Klan, underground. But not before forces expedited Reconstruction's decline and Confederates' establishment of the big lie, which made many Americans forget the records that survivors like Eliza and Edward created. And I Saw Death Coming, I used testimonies like theirs to challenge the failure narrative of Reconstruction by highlighting the story of African Americans who leapt from the frying pan of slavery into the fires of freedom. And I wanted to honor survivors and their descendants by centering and amplifying their stories. And I do that because today, many of us imagine emancipation as a triumphant event, and it truly was. But Kara Walker's 2012 portrayal of Reconstruction atrocities, the moral arc of history, serves as a fitting representation of the consequences of the original sin of American slavery. Yes, emancipation and Reconstruction bent the arc of American history towards justice, but hatred for African Americans curved it back towards the barbarity of night riding, lynchings, and massacres. And we know this history, we have access to it today because brave men and women like Eliza stepped forward to document it. What people targeted in the war after the Civil War knew and tried to communicate to anyone who would listen was that families were the cornerstones of Black people's individual and collective freedom. Family was the glue that had bound them together. Voting, office holding, and equal rights were just a means to a future in which Black families would be secure. That was why Confederates struck at the heart of Black people's freedom when they overthrew the revolutionary experiment in multiracial democracy. Understanding Black family stories of racing into freedom and the price white extremists made them pay in the war against it, Americans learned that the arc of our history doesn't always bend towards justice. The real story is essential to understanding why, more than a century and a half later, our struggle continues. Thank you.
So we have time for Q&A, and if you will go to the mics if you have a question. Can I ask it from here? You're streaming it, so. Oh, okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for your book and your talk. Did I hear you say the big lie?
Yes.
And it's interesting because that's the term we're using now for the denial during the election. So I just want to have it clear in my head. The big lie is that Reconstruction failed.
Yes.
When it was really destroyed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I call it the big lie of the 19th century.
Okay.
You know, so it's not the big lie of today, but it's the big lie of the 19th century that Reconstruction failed.
Mm-hmm.
When what we know is that it was overthrown and abandoned. Yeah. But the argument that Reconstruction failed enables Confederates to continue attacking Black people, to help get the federal troops out of the South, and for them to be able to establish Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Right.
Reconstruction is probably the saddest period for me, the way it was destroyed. And it makes you understand why things are like they are today. It's just really sad to me.
So I agree, but I also it's one of my, believe it or not, it's one of my favorite moments of history. Mm-hmm. And it's because African Americans did so much, right? Yeah. You know, they laid the foundation. The rights that we enjoy today, we only have them because of the fights that they waged during Reconstruction. They didn't have a say about it being overthrown, right? They did everything they needed to do to expand American freedom and democracy, right? And the forces of white supremacy organized against them. But they still left like this incredible foundation for Black people and Americans who believe in justice to build on, right? So when we think about the civil rights movement, sometimes my students say, well, I love the civil rights movement, because, we got all of these rights, but I have to remind them, but the foundation was laid during Reconstruction. Martin Luther King Jr. said, what did he say? We want what you put on paper, right? And he wasn't only talking about the Declaration of Independence, he's talking about the US Constitution and the expansion during Reconstruction. So civil rights activists were very mindful of holding the nation to the promise of Reconstruction. And so, we owe like an incredible debt. So we do have to honor like this, what was lost during that period, but we also have to sort of recognize and I think sort of pay respect to all of the work that they did. All of the rights and freedoms that we enjoy today, we have because of what they were able to do during that period.
Most certainly. And I'm glad you're telling this story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, how you doing today?
Hello.
I was going to say during Reconstruction, because you had like the Freedmen's Bank and a lot of those institutions that were dismantled. But I'm thinking like, how did African people or Black people get the subsidizing for Reconstruction after that? And then also like nowadays, what could we do to kind of get our mind focused on investing in those same communities now today?
So is the first part of the question like how did they get like the resources to build those things?
Yes, ma'am.
So because they're being paid for their work, right? They're being paid for their work, and one of the things I said is that they worked harder for themselves than they did for the people who held them in bondage, because now they have the opportunity to reap the rewards of it. So they sacrificed a lot. The fact that Abe and Eliza in 5 years saved the equivalent of $200,000. I don't have $2,000, right? Or excuse me, I don't have $200,000 in the bank. But they did because they worked hard. And they saved and they sacrificed because they had their eye on the prize of the future for their children. And so they were, thoughtful of it. And I think some of that comes from having spent most of their lives in slavery, right? No one has spent more time thinking about freedom than Black people because they have been denied it. They're outside the circle of freedom. So when they get the chance, that's why I use the language of the sprint. They run into freedom. And they make, and they are industrious, and they make and save a lot of money. And that's why they're targeted. So the Freedmen's Bank collapses for a variety of reasons. There are a lot of economic crises during the time, but it's not because Black people weren't sort of industrious. It's not because they weren't saving. It's not because they weren't doing what they needed to do. They did absolutely what they needed to do. A lot of times the Freedmen's Bureau gets the credit for the Black schools, but there are Black schools on the ground before the Freedmen's Bureau arrived. And it comes from the newly freed people who are working in the fields in the day, and they are taking care of the teachers, and they are earning money to pay the teachers at night. They build the schools. They save the money to get the supplies to heat the schools, to have the sort of speller books, et cetera. They do that because that's how important they understood it to be. Now, I'm a historian. I studied the past. Sociologists would probably be able to speak better about what's happening today. But I believe that knowing how hard people fought and sacrificed and what they were able to build could be a source of inspiration. I would say it's a source of inspiration for my students, because they say, I had no idea. I had no idea that we had all of this, that we built all of this. And so, for them, it's the sort of like, okay, what can we do to rebuild this today and then hold on to it while we're living in the midst of a reality of a resurgence of white supremacy? Because I think that's the struggle. Black people have built, they have made the most of American freedom and democracy. But there's always the white backlash to Black people's success. And so I don't quite know how we address that without confronting like the realities of white supremacy. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening to you, Ms. Williams. Thank you for coming, and thank everyone for coming.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your depth of knowledge. Do you believe that love always conquers hate?
That's a hard question. I'll be honest and say, I don't know, because I think sometimes hate can actually undermine love. I think that it actually, what we see with some of these survivors is that they are irreparably harmed by what happened to them. The violence often tends to corrode communities. People turn on each other in their desperation to live through what happened to them. I think for some, love does, but I don't think it's universal. One of the families I study, and they're in the book, they go through this horrible attack, but I find them in 1885, still together. And they survived one of the worst attacks. And you just, you don't believe, and some historians have looked at what happened. They said, there's no way they could stay together. There's no way they stayed together. But I found them 15 years later in a new community, still together. I don't know what their inner lives were like. I don't know what their relationships were like, but that they're together says something. So for them, love may have conquered hate. But I don't know that happens for everyone.
Do you believe that love, L-O-V-E, always conquers hate?
No. Not universally. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for your talk and thanks for coming out and asking questions. I appreciate what you were saying because I had never really put it together before about kind of the narrative about Reconstruction being a lie, helping the white supremacist dismantlement of the Reconstruction government that people created, and just the parallels to today as much as we can draw them about kind of this narrative that like the welfare state or the government has failed, the public good has failed, right, and therefore we should dismantle it and privatize it. And this is a really right-wing attack on public goods that should go to actually serve the people. So I just wanted to share that because that's something that I was connecting from what you were saying, and I appreciate you drawing that out. And then I'm really curious because I agree, like Reconstruction is the most inspiring and just fundamentally amazing part of American history, where you really see this opening for people across racial lines and just coming up from, horrible oppression to like create a new world in this brief period of time before it's crushed. And W.E.B. Du Bois calls it like, or at least ending slavery, the first general strike. Mm-hmm. And I was curious if you could speak more to kind of the collective organizing during Reconstruction, because it's, it was resting on these individuals like working incredibly hard. But as I understand it too, maybe it's particularly like in the cities, where, for example, like women laundry workers, like imposed getting wages. They went on a strike when they weren't paid their wages because they're wage workers now. They're not enslaved. And so a lot of this came from the collective organizing to create this new economic structure and to enforce the rights that they had won. So I'm so curious, other stories that you have or thoughts on that.
Right. So I think that's a great question. there's a lot of collective work, and sometimes it's just about the labor, but other times they're organizing and engaging in collective action to buy land. This is a time where you see the establishment of what will later come to be called these Black towns. So there's these little Black villages, so they're organizing to buy land in order to set up their own communities and to be very self-sufficient, so they don't have to rely on or deal with the sort of external forces. There is organization in terms of, you still have the ongoing work stoppages, et cetera. And this is before the 1880 strike in Atlanta. There is another washerwomen strike in Jackson, Mississippi earlier. I think it's like 1866. So you do have a lot of this collective action where people are supporting each other because they know there are more of them than there are of the enslavers in some communities, and that the way to get the conditions, the work conditions and the living conditions they want, it helps if they organize their labor. So there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of collective work in terms of establishing businesses and supporting businesses in the communities, those little sort of like businesses that we see crop up. So there's a lot of that going on during Reconstruction, and it continues afterwards. So you see that throughout the 19th century, even into the early 20th century. But the challenge that they deal with is the violence that comes when they engage in organized action. The violence is different in a city like Atlanta or Jackson than it would be in a very rural community. So there are plenty of massacres of Black people who are organizing for labor or they're sort of trying to engage in work stoppages, trying to work collectively to advance their rights, to protect their rights and advance their interests. But some of those people are killed in the process. But that doesn't stop people from continuing to do it because they know that's the only way they'll be able to get some of the progress they want. So there is a lot of that. None of them could do it alone. They all have to do it together. And in some cases that does become a struggle because, some people are like, well, I'm going to work harder and this person isn't going to work harder. So, and the realities of white supremacy, to the point that I made to the gentleman with a question, it can sort of like do damage internally to the community, right? And so it can like white violence and extremism and oppression can have a corrosive effect on the community, especially when people have been targeted and killed, et cetera. And so that's part of the thing that becomes difficult to sort of grapple with. So there's the fast violence of a hit, like a sort of a punch, and then there's the slow violence, and so what you see is the sort of slow violence even after these kinds of attacks targeting of workers who are trying to organize. Because it can demoralize people, and sometimes they won't fight in the way that they would before, or they will leave the community, et cetera. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I also kind of had a follow-up, or
Sure.
It's a separate question. From what I understand as well, there was kind of different perspectives from the radical Republicans that were voted in to as representatives in government. And there is a difference between the more radical side of that and the less radical side of that. Yeah. And so I'm curious more about like some of those divisions, or where like they just didn't go far enough. Like, right. Of course, there was larger decisions made, like to withdraw the army from the occupation of the South. But I'm curious more of like where the power that elected representatives had, that maybe if they had been a little bit more radical, right. Or thank you.
Okay, so I think that's a really good question. So one of the things that we have been sold, we have been told that Reconstruction failed. We've also been told that white Northerners were all abolitionists, and that's a lie, right? And white Westerners too. They only begrudgingly accept emancipation in order to speed up the end of the war, right? So a lot of white Northerners and Westerners, they don't join the Union Army to destroy slavery. They joined the Union Army to protect the country the founding fathers created. And they said, we're not going to let the slaveocracy destroy the country because they lose an election. They need to just come back and win the next election, right? So they only begrudgingly, so this is the vast majority of white Northerners and Westerners, begrudgingly accept emancipation. And for many of them, and I talk about this in the book, they believe that emancipation only means release from bondage. It doesn't mean anything else, right? It doesn't mean the right to vote. It doesn't necessarily mean the right to family. It doesn't mean right to schools, Black businesses and ownership, none of that. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means they're released from bondage. Because that had been the great white Northerner and Westerner fear about emancipation. They were not, for the most part, abolitionists. Abolitionists represent like a rump population of the larger white population of the North and West. So there are those radical Republicans who are in Congress, and some of them, many of the radicals, or a good number of the radicals, are abolitionists. But I think it's important to recognize that the 13th Amendment barely passes, and that's with the South out, right? The Southern states haven't all come back into the Union. The 13th Amendment barely passes. The 14th Amendment barely passes. And I think that's a testament to how much white frustration, fear, and anxiety, keep those both in scare quotes, there was about Black people, about sort of sharing the American pie, right? And giving Black people access to the vote, et cetera. So these revolutionary reforms, they're able to get them through, but just barely. And I think what we also have to recognize is that the power of white conservatives in the North and West in terms of sort of whittling down the legislation. And I think so there's an editorial that comes out in Cincinnati after the 13th Amendment. And what it says is, slavery is dead, the Negro is not. There is the misfortune. So if you're thinking that the vast majority of white Northerners are sort of these cuddly abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, they are not, right? And we have to sort of be aware of that, and like how the fact that a lot of the sort of policies that we get barely pass and they're barely supported. What we do get with the Reconstruction Amendments is an enforcement clause. But white Northerners and Westerners will not support the enforcement of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment while Black people are being slaughtered in the South, right? You get some who say, maybe we should send like a few troops, but a lot of people are like, but the war is over. Let's let the ex-Confederates get back. Let's move on in terms of reconciliation and healing. So what has happened is that people have looked at the ex-Confederates and the radical Republicans, and they've ignored the moderates, right? And they've ignored the white conservatives in the North and West. They're in the Democratic Party, just like white Southerners are, right? And they are very rabidly racist in terms of their opposition to any rights. In a lot of Northern states, there's this question, they're saying, we didn't secede, the 15th Amendment should apply to us. And so I think some of the work that historians have got to do is a better job of enlightening the public about like how contentious these politics were, right? And looking more at some state level histories. When I talk to K through 12 teachers, I say, you're from Michigan like I am, you're from Wisconsin, et cetera. You need to see, or from California, you need to see where your state was. How did your state vote on each one of these amendments? What was the nature of the conversations? What was published in the newspaper? Because that will tell you a lot about your state, and it'll be clarifying. You'll be surprised. California is opposed to the 13th Amendment, not because they're worried about chattel slavery, but because they are intent on holding on to other systems of unfree labor that subjugate Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Pacific Island Americans in the region, in the state. They've got similar concerns about the 14th and 15th Amendment. And so this is why we need better histories of Reconstruction, right? So we can sort of get at the heart of this. And so when you understand that white Northern and Western opposition their willingness to let white Southerners overthrow Reconstruction, I think becomes clearer, like it comes into focus is what I should say. Because if anyone was in a position to stop white Southerners, to hold them accountable, it was white Northerners and Westerners. They knew about the violence, but they were happy to just sort of like, we're going to let the South handle their affairs. We got other things to deal with. We got the West. We got to drive Native Americans off their land, right? We've got imperial ambitions. We're tired of dealing with Black people protesting the injustices in the South. So we've got to have a better understanding about that white Northern and Western population and those and the people they put in Congress, because the people they put in Congress are acting with their constituents in mind. Yes, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening.
The first is just a statement. I had a professor, he always said, if we just followed the Constitution that all men are created equal, there would be no need for the amendments, the Civil Rights Bill, and things of that nature. I guess that always stuck in my head. That was just a statement. But my question is, does your book touch about reparations, specifically 40 acres and a mule? Because I think there's some like, what does it actually mean? People just think of 40 acres and a mule, but I don't know if that really meant what. Right. Okay.
Right.
You could touch about that.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is that it meant that for the people in that region. But I think what's important to recognize is that there are plenty of Black people who got land without 40 acres and a mule, right? It's only like for this period of time where that, where it's sort of promised. And then like Andrew Johnson sort of, revokes that. But Black people, they still manage to acquire land, right? On their own, because they're working for themselves. And that's why they'll be targeted, right? So I don't go to like more of the present day debates about reparations, but I think that people who wanted to potentially use my work to get a sense of what maybe some specific families may be owed, like some of the descendants of the people I talk about in the book, they may have like a claim, I don't know.
This will be the last question.
Hi, thank you for being here. Could you talk a little bit about how the families that you've featured in your book, how they transformed communities, not just theirs, but probably, the wider communities around them, white folks, everyone included. And did they keep numbers? Like when I've gone back and I've studied early, I'm a filmmaker, so early filmmakers, they got numbers for me. Black film exhibitioners would write down, we absolutely screened 32,000 eyes on this movie in Atlanta on this date. They were proud. They were inspired. They were inspired, I'm sure, by the families of the generation that you're covering. But could you talk about a little bit more about those families and how they're making those communities flourish? And if they kept numbers or tracked it.
I mean, a lot of the people who are targeted, they are elected officials, they're ministers, they're teachers, they're businessmen, they're philanthropists. So they're doing the work of community building. But a lot of people lose everything. They're like Eliza, right? And when you're run out of your home, like what records can you hold on to? Right? They lose everything, including their documentation. Some people are able to hold on to things and they're able to pass on wealth to their children, but a lot of them aren't. And from the records, a lot of people disappear, either because they have died, because they were older when they were attacked, they died later of their injuries. They left the community and they changed their name, because part of what would happen is that not only would white men target them in their community, they would follow them, right, to the next community and try to kill them while they're there. That's part of why Eliza wanted to escape to Demopolis. And so for a lot of people, like it's, very much like today, people with storms, et cetera, it's hard for people to hold on to that documentation. For a lot of people who are targeted, it's even harder to hold on to that documentation. And so numbers, they were probably able to pass on information to their children and their grandchildren. But as you know, as the information is passed on, that sort of memory gets lost over time. So I don't think that I only think that there are like a handful of families today of descendants who know that they're descendants because like that memory has been lost of who they were and what happened to them. But if families were searching and they looked in the Klan hearings, they would be able to potentially find some of their people and learn about what happened to them. What I will say is that when they testify before Congress, they do have numbers. They talk about how much property they have how much wealth they have. That is very well documented. What their wages were, what they were earning, that is well documented in the testimonies. It may not be in other places, but it's certainly in the testimonies.
And are people kind of honest about how they help communities beyond their own flourish? I mean, they're providing services at another level.
So, I mean, but these are people who are picking themselves up from slavery, right? So they are supporting their community. I guess I'm wondering what you think beyond what they're doing in terms of schools, churches, et cetera. So what do you think they should be doing beyond that?
Well, not what they should be doing. I'm just, in terms of allies or others outside of their community acknowledging allies acknowledging their work, how they're transforming community.
So I think there are Black people who recognize how they're transforming community. There may be some white people, select white people, who recognize how they're, the positive impact that they're having on community. So it's happening, but that doesn't stop them from being targeted and killed. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for this really enlightening conversation. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Applause.
Thank you very much.
So we have books out in the hallway for purchase. Please buy your book. Dr. Williams will be signing your book outside. And also we have the Compass newsletter outside. So for upcoming programs in February, we're having the Book Lovers Breakfast with Walter Mosley here. So please take a look at the Compass and come back for our future programs. Thank you so much, and go out and buy some books.
Thank you.